Welcome back. About 2 months after her mother's abduction, Today Show co-host Savannah Guthrie is opening up about what she saw at Nancy Guthrie's home and whether she believed those ransom notes. Here's CBS News correspondent Jonathan Vigliotti.
Too much to bear. To think that I brought this to her bedside.
In her first interview since her mother Nancy's kidnapping, Savannah Guthrie says she feared her fame made her mom a target.
And I just say, I'm so sorry, Mommy. I'm so sorry.
The Today Show co-host's pain raw as she told colleague Hoda Kotb about the call from her sister on February 1st.
She said, Mom's missing. And I said, what?
Yeah.
And we thought that she must have had like some kind of medical episode in the night and that somehow, the paramedics had come because the back doors were propped open.
That exchange happened on a phone call in the first hours of a nightmare that had barely begun, before the FBI task force, before the press conferences, before the masked figure on the doorbell camera became national news. Savannah Guthrie called her brother, and before she could finish telling him what she knew, he told her. He said, "I think she's been kidnapped for ransom." She asked one question. "Do you think because of me?" He said, "I'm sorry, sweetie, but yeah, maybe." And then Savannah Guthrie said 5 words that almost every news outlet reported and almost no one has stopped to examine. But I knew that. She already knew. This documentary is not about who law enforcement is looking at. It is about what this family already knows, and the growing distance between that knowledge and what the public has been told. Let's start with what Savannah Guthrie actually said about her brother, because the media summary of his background has consistently undersold it. In her interview with former Today co-anchor Hoda Kotb on March 26th, she did not say Camron had a military background. She did not say he served. She said he spent his career in the military, worked in intelligence, and is a fighter pilot. She called him brilliant, and she said, unprompted, before describing the rest of the conversation, that he saw very clearly right away what this was. That is a specific and deliberate description. Fighter pilot, military intelligence, career military, right away. Those words are not interchangeable with general service. Military intelligence is a professional discipline. It is the work of reading environments, assessing threats, and building accurate pictures of what is happening based on incomplete and rapidly changing information. It is not instinct. It is a methodology, trained and systematic approach to taking inputs that would look like chaos to most people and extracting signal from them with speed and precision. And that is exactly what Camron Guthrie did. He was not at the house. He had not seen the propped door, the blood on the porch, the removed Nest camera, the physical evidence that investigators were still assembling on the ground. He had a phone call. He had his sister's voice. He had the bare details of what she knew at that moment, and from that alone, he produced a complete and accurate operational read of what had happened to his mother. Now, ask yourself a question that the coverage of this case has consistently avoided. How does someone do that? The answer is not genius. The answer is not luck. The answer is that the information available to Camron Guthrie in those first moments, the victim, the family, the circumstances, was sufficient for a trained military intelligence analyst to recognize a pattern he already understood. Pattern recognition at that speed, at that accuracy, is not intuition. It is familiarity with the threat type. It is the product of years spent building analytical pictures of how people and organizations move, what they want, and how they go about getting it. Camron didn't guess. He assessed. There is a significant difference between those two things, and the difference matters enormously for what comes next in this investigation. Play that moment again in your mind. Not the part where Camron answers, the part just before it. Savannah says, I said, "Do you think because of me?" That question does not come from nowhere. You do not ask someone whether your fame is the reason your mother was kidnapped unless you have already, in your own mind, constructed the argument that it might be. That is not a grief response. Grief asks, where is she? Is she alive? Who did this? What Savannah asked was a liability question. She asked whether she was the cause, which means she had already considered it. This is the detail the Hoda Kotb interview cracked open, and most coverage immediately moved past. Savannah Guthrie did not form that theory during the call. She did not hear Camron say kidnapped for ransom and then think, wait, could this be because of me? She walked into that phone call already carrying the question. She had already done the work, and when Camron confirmed it, gently, reluctantly softened with, "I'm sorry, sweetie," her response was not surprise. Her response was, "But I knew that." 5 words, past tense, spoken with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been sitting with a truth they were hoping not to have confirmed. Think about what that means in terms of timeline. Nancy Guthrie disappeared in the overnight hours between January 31st and February 1st, 2026. In those first hours, before Tucson had begun a formal search, before the FBI was formally called, before any of the public apparatus of this investigation had been assembled, Savannah Guthrie had already identified celebrity targeting as the probable motive for her mother's abduction. She did not read that in a news report. She did not hear it from law enforcement. She built it herself, from the same raw information Camron had, the victim, the family, the circumstances, and she arrived at exactly the same conclusion. 2 people, 1 phone call, both already there. That is not coincidence. That is 2 people who know this family, know these vulnerabilities, and know this situation well enough to understand immediately, independently, without prompting, what the available evidence pointed toward. The question this documentary is asking begins exactly there. There is a moment in every difficult conversation where the language shifts, from exchanging information to managing emotion. Camron Guthrie reached that moment before he finished his first sentence. He did not say, yes.
How is it possible that we are having to make a video speaking to a kidnapper who took an 84-year-old woman in the dead of night in her pajamas with no shoes, without her medicine? This little person.
Tell me what you thought when you saw those images of the person who took your mother.
I can't imagine that is who she saw standing over her bed.
Yeah.
I can't.
It's probably because of you. He did not say, I've been thinking the same thing. He led with 3 words that the coverage has barely touched. I'm sorry, sweetie. That sequencing matters. He put the compassion before the confirmation. He apologized before he answered. That is not how you respond to a theory you're hearing for the first time. That is how you respond to a truth you have been carrying for hours. Maybe since the moment you first heard your mother was missing, dreading the moment you'd have to say it to the person it was going to hurt the most. The word sweetie is doing significant work in that sentence. Camron Guthrie is not a young man. Savannah is not a young woman. He called her sweetie. That is not adult sibling language for a routine exchange. It is the language of protection. The older brother who has processed something devastating and spent the intervening hours trying to figure out how to say it without destroying his sister. He had already done the analysis. He had already reached the conclusion. He was waiting for her to give him the opening. When she did, when she asked the question directly, he gave her the gentlest version of the answer he had. But he confirmed it. He did not retreat into uncertainty. He said, yeah, maybe. Not I don't know. not it's possible. He acknowledged the probability and then softened its edges as much as he could, and Savannah said, "But I knew that. What she is describing is not a conversation between two people discovering something together. It is a conversation between two people who arrived at the same place independently, meeting in the middle to acknowledge what neither of them had said out loud yet. Not a revelation scene, a confirmation scene." In the weeks since that phone call, Camron Guthrie has made limited public statements. He recorded a direct video addressed to the kidnappers on Instagram. He appeared alongside his sisters in the sibling video responding to the ransom note reports. He has been present, and he has been vocal about wanting his mother home. What he has not done in any public statement, any interview, any appearance, is discuss his own assessment of this crime. He has not described what he knew and when he knew it. He has not explained the reasoning behind his ransom identification on that phone call. He has not shared what his military intelligence background told him about the operational structure of this abduction. He has not said publicly what he said to Savannah privately. That is not silence. That is selection, and selection always has a reason. Before this documentary goes any further in the direction it's headed, the record needs to be precise about Tommaso Cioni, because the public conversation around this case has consistently conflated his presence with guilt, and that conflation has obscured more than it has revealed. Tommaso Cioni is the husband of Annie Guthrie, Savannah's older sister. He is a science teacher and musician, born in Italy, living in Tucson for approximately 20 years. He and Annie married in 2006. By every documented account, he was a private man with no public profile before February 2026. He teaches biology. He plays bass in a local band. He forages for mushrooms and writes poetry in Italian. On the night of January the 31st, 2026, Tommaso Cioni drove Nancy Guthrie home from dinner. This is confirmed. The Pima County Sheriff told the New York Times directly, Cioni dropped Nancy off and ensured she made it safely inside before leaving. He was the last family member to see her. That is his documented connection to the events of that night. What happened after he left his mother-in-law at her front door is the question this investigation was created to answer. His car was examined. His property was searched. Authorities were seen at the Annie Guthrie and Cioni residence. Days into the investigation, he was questioned. Former News Nation host Ashley Banfield publicly claimed a law enforcement source identified him as a possible suspect. The Pima County Sheriff's Office explicitly pushed back on that characterization. No law enforcement agency has named Tommaso Cioni as a suspect or a person of interest in this case. He has not been charged with anything. He has not been accused of anything by the authorities conducting this investigation. What the documented evidence around Tommaso Cioni establishes is he was present. He was the last to see Nancy before she disappeared. He exists within the close orbit of this family. What it does not establish, what it cannot establish on its own, is that he planned this, that he designed a sophisticated ransom kidnapping targeting his own mother-in-law, that he possessed the specific knowledge, the strategic thinking, and the operational capability to engineer an abduction of this complexity and then disappear without a traceable fingerprint. Proximity is not architecture. Presence is not planning. And the difference between those two things is where the real question, in this case, begins. Let's talk about what this crime actually required, not in generalities, in specifics. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She was in poor health and required daily medication to survive. She was taken from her bed in the overnight hours, in the dark, without her shoes, without her medicine, by at least one armed and masked individual. Her doorbell camera was physically removed from its mount. Her pacemaker monitoring application was disconnected at 2:28 in the morning a detail that suggests either direct technical knowledge of her home setup or information provided by someone who had that knowledge. The back doors were found propped open. Her blood was found on the porch. Multiple ransom notes subsequently emerged through media outlets. At least one demanded millions of dollars in Bitcoin. Savannah has stated publicly that she believes most of those notes were not genuine, but that two were real. The two the family responded to, the two they made videos addressing directly. Now walk through what executing that plan required: target selection. Whoever took Nancy Guthrie did not randomly select an elderly woman in a Tucson neighborhood. They selected the mother of one of the most recognizable faces in American morning television. That is a deliberate and calculated choice. It means someone in the planning of this operation knew the relationship between Nancy Guthrie and Savannah Guthrie well enough to evaluate that relationship as leverage, to determine that Savannah had both the financial resources and the emotional exposure to pay a significant ransom demand, and that she would do so without involving law enforcement more than she had to. Location intelligence. Nancy Guthrie's home address is not publicly advertised. She is not a public figure. Whoever planned this abduction knew where she lived, knew her routines with enough precision to time the entry in the middle of the night, and knew the internal layout and security setup of her home well enough to remove the camera and disconnect the pacemaker app at a specific moment. Operational execution. The FBI's surveillance footage shows a masked individual approaching the property in a manner that investigators have described as deliberate. The backpack, identified as a black 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack, was a specific choice. The mask was a specific choice. The timing was a specific choice. Nothing about the documented approach to Nancy Guthrie's home suggests improvisation. Demand structure. The ransom notes that the family considers genuine demanded millions of dollars in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is decentralized, pseudonymous, and designed to be difficult to trace. Specifying Bitcoin as the payment method is not a spontaneous decision. It requires a minimum of technical awareness, advanced planning, and a considered approach to avoiding financial detection. Assemble that profile. Specific target selection based on family leverage, location intelligence about a private individual's home, deliberate operational execution, including technical knowledge of the home's security systems, and a sophisticated payment demand structure designed to minimize traceability. The person or persons who planned this operation had studied this family. They understood the leverage. They knew the home. They had thought carefully in advance about how to get paid without getting caught. The question this documentary is raising is not whether Tommaso Cioni drove Nancy home that night. He did. The question is whether Tommaso Cioni, a 50-year-old biology teacher from Tuscany, designed and executed a ransom kidnapping that required this level of operational sophistication and this depth of knowledge about the Guthrie family's internal architecture. That is a different question, and the evidence, as documented, does not answer it in his direction. Every successful ransom kidnappings targeting a celebrity's family member shares a structural characteristic. It requires insider knowledge, not insider knowledge in the criminal conspiracy sense, though that is always a possibility investigators evaluate. Insider knowledge in the operational sense, understanding the target, the family, the home, and the response patterns well enough to build a plan with a reasonable expectation of success. The longer a kidnapping goes unsolved, the more that operational sophistication tells investigators about the planner's relationship to the family they targeted. This case has now run nearly 2 months without a confirmed suspect, confirmed ransom exchange, or a confirmed location for Nancy Guthrie. The ransom notes the family considers genuine have not produced a resolution. The FBI task force, which brings resources and analytical capabilities far beyond local law enforcement, has not publicly moved to arrest anyone. That timeline is informative. It tells investigators that whoever planned this understood something fundamental about how this family would respond, what steps they would take, and how to stay several moves ahead of the investigation. That is not the signature of a random opportunist who happened to connect Savannah Guthrie's public profile to her elderly mother's address. Consider what insider knowledge of the Guthrie family would actually look like in operational terms. It means knowing that Savannah Guthrie has the financial resources to meet a significant ransom demand. It means understanding her public profile well enough to calculate her emotional exposure, that she would pay, that she would exhaust every option, that she would not walk away from her mother's life regardless of the cost or the risk. It means knowing Nancy Guthrie's address, her daily routines, her medical vulnerabilities, and her home's security setup with enough detail to plan entry, disable monitoring, and exit without leaving recoverable evidence. It means knowing that taking Nancy specifically, rather than any other figure adjacent to the Guthrie family, would produce maximum leverage with minimum legal exposure. Because an 84-year-old woman with fragile health creates urgency that only increases with time. That is not a profile assembled by someone looking at Savannah Guthrie's Instagram page. That is knowledge built from proximity, from relationship, from time spent inside the architecture of this family, understanding how it works, where its resources sit, and where its vulnerabilities are deepest. The public conversation has centered on Tommaso. He drove Nancy home, his property was searched, his name entered the coverage early. But Tommaso entered this family through Annie, through the Tucson branch. The quieter branch, the branch furthest from the national profile and the financial leverage and the specific celebrity exposure that this ransom operation was built to exploit. There is another member of this family who was born into it, who has known Savannah Guthrie his entire life, who understands the full weight of her public platform and the full depth of what her mother means to her, who spent a career in military intelligence, the professional discipline of knowing things about people, of mapping pressure points, of assessing what a subject will do when subjected to a specific and calculated kind of threat. Law enforcement has cleared this family. This documentary is not accusing that person of a crime. It is asking a question that the public conversation has not asked clearly enough. When you lay the operational profile of this abduction next to the people who had the knowledge to plan it, and you follow the evidence with discipline rather than sentiment, where does it point? Before this act goes further, the record needs to reflect something clearly. Law enforcement has confirmed that the Guthrie family, including Camron Guthrie, has been cleared as suspects in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. What follows is not a criminal accusation against any member of this family. It is an examination of what this family appears to know, what they have chosen to make public, and what the gap between those two things might mean for an investigation that has now run nearly 2 months without a resolution. Savannah Guthrie has been one of the most publicly visible family members of a missing person in recent American media history. She has made Instagram videos. She has issued public statements. She sat for a 3-part interview with Hoda Kotb nearly 2 months into the crisis. She has managed the public-facing dimension of this investigation with the fluency of someone who has spent decades understanding how information moves through media and what audiences receive. Look at what she has covered in those public appearances. Her mother's physical condition, the fragility, the medication, the pain, her own grief, the sleepless nights, the darkness, the thoughts she cannot stop thinking, the ransom notes, which she believes are genuine, which she believes are not, the masked figure from the doorbell camera footage, which she called absolutely terrifying. The family's emotional state, her direct apology to her mother, to her siblings, to her children, all of that is real. All of it is genuine. Savannah Guthrie is not performing grief. She is in it, and none of what she has said publicly is false. But look at what is absent from every one of those appearances. She has not described what Camron's full assessment contained, beyond the ransom identification. She has not said what the family's own private picture of this crime looks like, who it points toward, what it rules out. She has not described the conversations she has had with federal investigators about what her brother told her in those first hours. She has not disclosed whether the family has developed any view of likely suspects beyond what they have shared with the FBI as a journalist. And Savannah Guthrie is a credentialed, experienced journalist who has covered some of the most consequential stories in American public life, understands something precisely. The shape of a story is determined not only by what is said, but by what is left out. Every editorial decision to include one detail is simultaneously a decision to not include another. She knows how this works. She has built her career on it. The public narrative she has constructed around this case is emotionally complete and informationally partial. It contains everything a grieving daughter would say. It contains nothing a military intelligence operative's sister would say. That is a choice. It may be exactly the right choice. One the FBI has specifically requested, one that protects the integrity of an ongoing investigation. But it is a choice. And accepting it as the full picture is the mistake this documentary is asking you not to make. Watch how Savannah frames her brother. She is specific about his credentials. Fighter pilot, military intelligence, career military. She calls him brilliant. She establishes his authority to read this situation. She frames him deliberately and precisely as someone whose assessment carries professional weight because of who he is and what he has spent his life doing. And then she stops. She gives the audience enough to understand that Camron's read was authoritative. She does not give them what the rest of that read contained. Think about what a military intelligence operative who identified this as a ransom kidnapping in the first hours of the crisis would have done next. He would not have stopped at the identification. Identification is step one. Step two, the step that military intelligence training specifically prepares you for, is threat assessment. Who has the operational capability to plan this? Who had access to the necessary information about the target? Who benefits from the leverage this abduction creates? What is the demand structure likely to look like? What is the optimal response from the family's position? Camron Guthrie did not just call this a ransom kidnapping on instinct. He spent his career building exactly this kind of analytical picture. Rapidly, under pressure from incomplete information. He had access to inputs that no external investigator could match. He knew the family. He knew Savannah's profile in granular detail. He knew Nancy's circumstances, her location, her vulnerabilities. He understood the internal geography of the Guthrie family in a way that only someone born into it could. Did he share his full assessment with the FBI? Almost certainly. Federal investigators would have spoken to him within days, if not hours, of the disappearance being formally reported. His background alone would have made him a priority interview. A career military intelligence operative with direct family knowledge of the victim and the family structure the kidnapper was exploiting. Did he share that full assessment with Savannah? The phone call tells us there was a significant conversation. Savannah's account of it ends at the ransom identification. But that call continued, and in the weeks since, these siblings have been in Arizona together, coordinating public statements and cooperating with the investigation in the same spaces, having conversations that have not been described on camera. What Camron's fuller assessment contained, who it pointed toward, what operational conclusion it reached, what it said about the insider knowledge required to plan something like this, None of that has appeared in Savannah's public account. She gave us his credentials. She gave us his first conclusion. She did not give us his reasoning. In an investigation of this complexity, the reasoning is where everything lives. Come back to the question Savannah asked. Do you think because of me? In the coverage of the Hoda Kotb interview, that question was almost universally framed as a moment of raw grief. A daughter terrified and guilt-ridden, confronting the possibility that her public life made her mother a target. That reading is not wrong. The guilt is real. Savannah said it herself on camera with tears. The idea that she brought this to her mother's bedside is almost impossible to carry. But there is a second reading of that question that the coverage has not explored, and it is worth examining carefully. When Savannah asks, "Do you think because of me?" she is directing the frame of the crime. She is placing the origin of this abduction in her own visibility, her celebrity, her platform, her income. In doing that, she positions the explanation for Nancy's disappearance as abstract fame. The idea that strangers somewhere identified opportunity where Savannah's public profile intersected with her elderly mother's vulnerability. That is a legible story. The public can hold it, understand it, and find it emotionally coherent without needing to look any closer at the people inside this family. Famous woman, opportunistic criminals, a tragedy that flows directly from the exposure that comes with being on national television every morning. What that framing does not ask is the harder question: whether the people who planned this were strangers at all, whether the celebrity angle was the discovery of an outsider looking in, or the calculation of someone already inside who understood Savannah's resources and her love for her mother, not from a distance but from proximity. Whether the motive attributed to Savannah's fame is accurate as a description of the crime's origin, or whether it is the most comfortable available explanation, one that keeps the story clean and the scrutiny pointed outward. Savannah Guthrie is a skilled communicator. The framing she has constructed, the public guilt, the apology to her mother, the repeated emphasis on not knowing anything for certain, the question that places herself at the center of the motive, keeps the public story in a register that is both emotionally real and narratively safe. It is a story about celebrity and consequence. It is not a story that invites scrutiny of the people closest to Nancy Guthrie. This documentary is not suggesting that framing is deliberate misdirection. It is observing that the effect is real, regardless of the intent. Every moment the public conversation is about Savannah's guilt over her own fame. It is not about who specifically had the access, the knowledge, and the operational capacity to plan what happened to her mother. Those are different conversations. Only one of them has been happening publicly. Managing what the public knows about an active federal investigation is not the same as obstructing it. That distinction needs to be named clearly before this act goes any further. Savannah Guthrie is cooperating with the FBI. Her family is cooperating with the FBI. Law enforcement has said so explicitly. The Guthrie family has not been accused of any wrongdoing. They are not suspects, they are victims. A family that has been living inside a federal kidnapping investigation for nearly 2 months while simultaneously managing their professional lives, their public communications, and the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing where their mother is or whether she is still alive. What this documentary is examining is separate from the legal question. It is examining the public narrative, the story that has been constructed for the audience watching from outside. And in that public narrative, there are choices being made. What to say, when to say it. How much of what this family knows privately has been offered to the public, and how much has been held carefully back. Savannah Guthrie's position in this investigation is structurally unique. She is simultaneously the grieving daughter, the family's primary public spokesperson, and a professional media figure with decades of experience understanding how information shapes perception and how narratives get built. She is not a passive participant in the way this story has been told. She is its primary narrator. She controls the frame more completely than any other person in it. And primary narrators make choices. She has chosen to frame this as a story about celebrity and consequence. She has chosen to emphasize her own guilt and her own grief as the emotional center of the public account. She has chosen to describe Camron's credentials and his initial conclusion without describing what his analysis produced beyond that conclusion. She has chosen to make public statements that maintain the emotional reality of this crisis, genuine, real, and moving, while protecting the informational architecture of what her family actually knows from the inside. Those choices may be exactly what the FBI has asked for. In an active federal investigation with a missing person still in captivity, public disclosure of the family's private intelligence picture could alert whoever is holding Nancy to what investigators know and what direction the investigation is moving. Operational security is a legitimate and serious concern. The FBI managing what flows through the family's public statements is standard investigative practice. But they are choices. They are not the neutral output of a grieving family telling the public everything they know. Recognizing them as choices, deliberate, structured, and consequential, is the difference between watching this story and understanding it. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She was taken without her shoes, without her medicine, without warning, in the dark, from her own bed. She has been missing for nearly 2 months. Every day that passes without a resolution is another day. An 84-year-old woman without her medication is somewhere we cannot reach. The family has made their understanding of that urgency plain. Savannah has described waking every night in the middle of the night, imagining her mother's terror. She called it unthinkable. She called it too much to bear, and yet the public picture of this case, the picture that might produce a tip, a lead, the piece of information that breaks this open, remains carefully managed. Partial, shaped by the choices of the family member who controls the narrative most completely. This documentary is not arguing that Savannah Guthrie is wrong to manage what she discloses. The reasons for doing so may be sound, serious, and directly requested by the federal investigators running this case. Protecting operational security in an active kidnapping investigation is not a secondary concern. It can be the difference between recovery and outcome, but there is a possibility, one that deserves to be named out loud, that the management of the public narrative is simultaneously protecting something beyond the investigation. If Savannah is managing what the public knows about Camron's full assessment, whether to protect him from the kind of online speculation that engulfed Tommaso, whether to avoid drawing scrutiny to someone she loves, or whether for reasons that are not yet visible from the outside, and if that management is leaving any part of what this family knows privately in a space the public cannot reach, then there is a cost. It is measured not in reputation or in discomfort. It is measured in time. Time that Nancy Guthrie does not have. This is not an accusation. It is the hardest available question in a case where every question is hard. And it deserves to be held without flinching because the alternative, accepting the managed narrative as complete, is comfortable for everyone except the 84-year-old woman it has not yet brought home. There is a version of this story where Savannah Guthrie's love for her brother, her instinct to shield him from public speculation in the middle of the worst crisis her family has ever faced, is the most human thing in it, the most understandable, the most forgivable, the most recognizable impulse in this entire case. And there is a version of this story where that love, however genuine and however deep, is part of the reason Nancy Guthrie has not come home. Both of those versions can be true at the same time. That is what makes this the most difficult question in the case, and the one least likely to be answered by anything Savannah Guthrie says on camera. Here is what the documented record tells us about the FBI's relationship to the information this family holds. Special Agent in Charge Hyth Janka of the FBI Phoenix Division has confirmed publicly that the agency is in active communication with the Guthrie family, advising them from a law enforcement perspective. The family is cooperating fully. Any decision regarding a ransom payment is, per Janke, ultimately the family's determination to make. That is the official picture. Now consider what it implies. The FBI has spoken to Savannah. They have spoken to Camron. They have his account of what he knew, when he knew it, and how he arrived at his assessment on that phone call in the first hours of the crisis. They have, in other words, the full output of a military intelligence analyst who processed the available inputs in real time and produced an accurate operational read before the investigation had formally begun. That is not a peripheral data point. That is a primary investigative asset. A credentialed career military intelligence operative with direct and deep family knowledge of the victim, the family structure, the financial resources in play, and the emotional architecture that the ransom demand was specifically designed to exploit, who had already independently assembled the threat picture before law enforcement arrived. The FBI would have spent significant time with Camron Guthrie, not just to take a statement, but to understand what exactly his full assessment contained. Not just the ransom identification, they could establish that from the physical evidence, but the rest of the analysis. Who specifically, Camron's training and his family knowledge pointed toward when he mapped the operational requirements of this crime against the people who had the information to plan it. That conversation happened. Its contents are not public, which means the FBI is not working from the same partial picture the rest of us have been given. They have Camron's full assessment. They have the private conversations between siblings. They have the informational architecture of what this family knows in its entirety, not just the portion that has appeared in Savannah's public statements. The public is watching the managed version of this story. The FBI is working from the complete one. Whether those two versions are pointing toward the same conclusion, or whether they diverge in ways we cannot yet see from the outside, is the question this investigation will ultimately have to answer. And when it does, the gap between what Savannah Guthrie said publicly and what her brother told federal investigators privately may turn out to be the most significant space in the entire case. Nancy Guthrie went missing in the overnight hours between January 31st and February 1st, 2026, from her home in Tucson, Arizona. She was 84 years old. She was taken without her shoes, without her medicine, in the dark. She has not been found. Everything in this documentary, the phone call, the 5 words, the careful public statements, the operational profile of a sophisticated ransom kidnapping, the gap between what a military intelligence operative knew in the first hours and what has been said in every interview and public appearance since, exists in the shadow of that fact. Savannah Guthrie told Hoda Kotb something on March 26, 2026, that deserves more time than the coverage has given it. She described a phone call in which her brother, a career military intelligence operative and fighter pilot, told her, before she could finish describing the circumstances, that her mother had been kidnapped for ransom. She asked him if it was because of her. He apologized before he answered. And then he said, "Yeah, maybe." And then Savannah Guthrie said, 5. Words that told us more than anything else she has said publicly since this nightmare began. But I knew that. She had already built the theory. She had arrived there herself, in the dark, in those first hours before her brother confirmed it. 2 people who know this family better than anyone else in the world had, both independently, in the earliest moments of the crisis, constructed the same picture of what had happened to Nancy Guthrie. And why? What remains unanswered is not the motive. It is the direction the motive points when you follow it with discipline rather than comfort. Celebrity targeting does not explain itself. It is an explanation that requires a next question. Who, specifically, knew enough about this family to exploit that leverage? Who had the access, the knowledge, and the operational understanding to build a plan that has eluded a federal task force for nearly 2 months? Savannah asked her brother one question. He gave her the softest version of the answer he had. She already had the other half. Somewhere in the space between what this family knows and what they have said out loud, somewhere in the conversation that continued after the phone call ended, in the rooms in Arizona where these siblings have been together since February, in the full picture that Camron Guthrie's career gave him the tools to construct. The answer to where Nancy Guthrie is may already exist. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, contact the FBI tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI or visit tips.fbi.gov. A reward of more than $1 million has been offered for information leading to her safe return. And if the questions this documentary raised are ones you need to sit with, subscribe. Because this case is not closed, and neither is this story.